Your Excellencies, ambassadors and representatives of the member states of the Organization of Southern Cooperation, distinguished members of the diplomatic corps, most distinguished dean of this most beautiful college in which we are today being hosted, أصحاب السعادة والمعالي, damas y caballeros, mesdames et messieurs. A year ago, we had the honor, as was mentioned by the Dean, to convene a celebration of OSC Day, commemorating the entry into force of the Constitutive Charter of the only intergovernmental organization of our three continents. At the time, I had the distinct honor to take stock of the progress that had been achieved from the establishment of our headquarters in Addis Ababa in 2023, looking at all the advances that we had collectively made institutionally, as member states, as civil society organizations and intellectuals in our endeavor to erect, to edify a third way of development. Today, it would seem irresponsible were I not to start by stating that in the past year, ladies and gentlemen, the world that we knew, the order with which we had grown so very familiar, has been completely and utterly transformed. The circumstances from my speech a year ago, ladies and gentlemen, are very different. At the risk of stating the obvious, stating platitudes, and at the risk of repeating myself, ladies and gentlemen, traditional aid, as we knew it, is not only agonizing, but there is an argument to be made that it is in its death throes. The dismantling of donor agencies, with one that I do not necessarily need to mention by name, has caused a lot of suffering, real, palpable, immense, within our countries. But it also generated a necessary awakening, that it was no longer sufficient, that it was no longer possible without moral anguish to sustain, to continue engaging within a development architecture that was at best artificial. And the international order that prevailed over the past 3 decades is now, perhaps, an international disorder. And of course, the tariffs, ladies and gentlemen, that were announced at the time, since January, put our countries, put the world, north and south alike, in disarray. It generated, of course, uncertainty, but it also announced the passing of old-held certainties. In other words, the old world is dying, but the new world is still struggling to be born. And of course, even for our collective organization, that we are here together to celebrate, The start of 2025, and here transparency is demanded. The start of 2025 has been a difficult one, despite the fact that the organization does not depend on the traditional funders that have disappeared, but because of the ripple effect that this period of uncertainty has generated. But the strength of a collective, ladies and gentlemen, the vitality of a collective is not measured by the number of obstacles that one finds along the way. It is determined, it is measured by the determination to meet those challenges, to overcome them, and to continue walking. For there has never been a time, ladies and gentlemen, despite the uncertainties, there has never been a time more propitious, more opportune for our countries of the Greater South to not only engage in a game of multilateral musical chairs, but to decidedly fulfill their historic role, address the structural injustices of the order that we had inherited, and transform, not merely reform, our reality. It is, in other words, the time for our countries to engage proactively in the collective construction of a third way of development. From the Greater South, by the Greater South, yet for the entirety of humanity, and not as a model, universal, to be imposed without regard to contexts, priorities, sensibilities, but as a powerful river, a vital river in which multiple currents converge and flow, sovereign but synergetic, towards the altar of the horizon. Because history, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, has no place for those who wait, for those who hesitate. We must, as countries, decidedly, purposefully, move forward, seize this moment to reshape our world. But this requires unity. Unity which has historically been the terrain of most of our defeats as countries. But not a unity that is based upon uniformity, because that would be denying ourselves. We need a unity that feeds, that nourishes itself from our diversity, from the diversity that characterizes our Greater South, linguistic, ideological, cultural. And for this unity, a unity in diversity to emerge, we also require instruments as countries. And in this regard, the Organization of Southern Cooperation, that I have the honor to lead as Secretary General, is one such instrument. An instrument whose consolidation, whose further strengthening is not merely desirable. It is an imperative. And in these uncertain times, from the Secretariat of the OSC, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ours is the view, ours is the conviction that now is not the time, despite difficulties at the international stage, now is not the time to have retreats, to have moments of protectionism, of reverting back on hard-won gains. Now is the time to push forward as a collective of nations. And of course, the record of the Organization of Southern Cooperation over the last 2.5 years in terms of the Greater South Information System, in terms of the scholarship program that we launched, in terms of the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, is there. It is encouraging. But we, at least, I dare say this, in the spirit of transparency, we are, from the Secretariat of the OSC, as mandated by our General Assembly, the club of the perpetually dissatisfied. We look back at what has been achieved with pride, yes, but we are determined to look towards what is yet to be achieved. And in this OSC Day, in those uncertain times, our version of pushing forward, ladies and gentlemen, implies putting into practice the common program adopted by the General Assembly for 2025-2026, of building knowledge-powered societies that address inequities within knowledge and enable our countries to better respond to the development needs and aspirations of our peoples. By, for instance, continuing the process of establishing transdisciplinary regional research centers within our countries that not only enable cutting-edge research, but also the application of knowledge to our needs and our priorities. Of becoming drivers of the technological revolution, rather than remaining its spectators on the sideline. And for this, ladies and gentlemen, donations, as generous as they may seem, and for which we might be grateful, perhaps, importation of costly technologies, none of these will bridge the gap and the divide that separates us from the future. Because closed source platforms, because patented technologies that we cannot integrate, that we cannot build upon, in 10 years' time, these will be obsolete. It is time for our countries to coordinate our efforts, to pool our resources together, to develop our own endogenous technologies, to leverage open source technologies, and above all, to focus on an exponential development of our technical capabilities. And this is why, from the OSC, over the upcoming year, we will be launching a Southern Commission on Artificial Intelligence to map out what already exists, and most importantly, to identify the means for our countries to pool our capacities together, pool our data together, to develop our own Southern artificial intelligence models that better respond to our contexts, our realities, and our priorities. We must, of course, as well, accelerate balanced and inclusive education, the transformation of our education systems towards balance and inclusivity. And in this regard, from the OSC, in this spirit of opening up routes and avenues for our youth to benefit from education systems that not only replicate the world, but respond to our priorities, our needs, and enable them to forge the future. It is in this sense that we will be working very closely over the upcoming months with our member states in order to strengthen the OSC Institute as the capacity building arm of our collective organization, and to expand its programs to receive more senior experts from our member states, but also to open up the Institute to multi-model capacity building, including through virtual means, and for our peoples more directly. We need to revitalize our cultural and artistic yields as countries. And this is why we will be working with our member states to nurture creative industries that don't just replicate the global art market, but that articulate from our perspectives, from our languages, new ways of reading the world, of narrating ourselves as countries, and to establish in this process cultural houses of the Greater South that may serve as points of encounter for our artists, our painters, our artisans, our poets, artistic residencies amongst our three countries. We must accelerate the pace towards the creation of shared green prosperity, which implies for the OSC the launch of a Southern Commission for ecologically driven development, where ecological policy is not merely a restriction, but opens up the door for wealth creation, for opportunities for our youth. And on the other, making operational the Greater South Development Bank, the GSDP, that we as countries may have alternative sources of funding that is less conditional, more concessional, more solidary, to enable us, ladies and gentlemen, and I dare say this at the risk of confirming the reputation that has been mine and which I have gained with much effort as an interminable speaker. But it is important, ladies and gentlemen, to recognize that as countries of the South, in this moment of uncertainty, it is not enough for us to point fingers at injustices, to lament our continued economic dependence, but instead to take our responsibilities as countries and address the structural deficiencies of our economies that generate our dependencies. And this requires instruments such as the Greater South Development Bank. Of course, all of this, ladies and gentlemen, within a framework of intensified South-South cooperation and integration. Today I understand that there is a very important meeting in Brussels between the African Union and the European Union. A very crucial forum, an important forum, because our endeavors from the OSC, from the South, have never been directed against the idea of cooperation with our northern friends and partners. Ours has always been a proactive proposal of reshaping the world and multilateralism on a more equitable basis. But I dare ask, where are the AU CELAC coordination meetings? Where are the ASEAN Arab League coordination meetings? If we are to have South-South cooperation, we must also ensure greater interoperability between our respective organizations. And the OSC stands ready to play the role of that bridge, to have greater African-Latin American coordination, greater Latin American-Asian coordination, and greater Asian-Arab coordination. And of course, this also requires solidifying the organization that the South deserves, which implies that over the upcoming year, we will be as well establishing a number of regional offices, not merely for representative purposes, but to bring the Secretariat closer to our member states and to the needs of our peoples. But the Secretariat, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, cannot perpetually, it is not destined to pull the vehicle of history. Its role is to accompany, to support, and in this regard, we must, as an imperative, ensure greater leadership, more proactive participation by our member states, by our countries who are the drivers of this process. And on the other, between those who pull and those who drive, we need the presence of our peoples. The presence of our peoples who are there to push when impulse falters. Because South-South cooperation, ladies and gentlemen, will have no future, no sustainability if it is limited to the agreements between our governments. These are essential. But in parallel, we must accompany those agreements with a genuine integration of our peoples, of building bridges between our peoples, because the links that are established between our peoples are more durable, more authentic, and more effective than the ones between governments that come and go. And it is in this context that I have the honor to welcome our distinguished, eminent guest, Professor Ricardo Forster, who is joining us all the way from Buenos Aires. Because his presence here today embodies that spirit of people-to-people links and exchanges. In fact, we had sent, as our eminent guest arrived here, an intellectual from Senegal to go to Buenos Aires, Addis Fall, to go to Buenos Aires because that is also how we build the framework of a South-South cooperation that is effective, concrete, palpable. Because there is, again, no South-South cooperation without our peoples knowing each other. And it is also in this spirit, in the continuation of this effort, that we are holding, at the end of June, the second edition of the Festival of the Greater South. The Festival of the Greater South that was convened last year here in Addis at our headquarters as a determination to provide a space, a popular annual encounter for our peoples, our artists, our singers, our musicians, our dancers to meet, exchange, create together. And it is in this sense that this second edition in June will be held in Buenos Aires in collaboration with UDWALC. And it is my sincere hope that you will all join us at that occasion Where's Kulsi? Kulsi. Do we have festival passports? Well, we will need to share passports with all of the individuals here. A passport that will give you free entry to the festival. And of course, I say all of this, ladies and gentlemen, I say all of this with the diplomatic restraint that are due in moments such as this. If some want to read between the lines, you are welcome to do so. But diplomatic speeches, whilst important, cannot stop us from conceiving what is far more important. The noble aspirations of our peoples, the historic responsibility that is ours, but above all, and this is why I am looking forward to today's conference, but most importantly, to re-legitimize, to renew the legitimacy of dreams. I know I sound absurd or foolish in so saying, but without dreams, without a horizon, without a utopia to which we continuously march, never reaching it, but getting ever so closer, there is no mobilization. And without mobilization, there is no transformation. The order that prevailed in the 1990s was a thief, because it's robbed us collectively of our ability to dream. And if OSC Day must be anything at all, then it must be the affirmation as peoples, as individuals, as countries, as organizations, that we are determined to reconquer our collective capacity to dream. Frantz Fanon, in Les Damnés de la Terre, had this extraordinary insight in which he said that each generation, out of relative obscurity, must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And ours, I believe, is certainly not the endeavor of betrayal, but it is the endeavor of construction, of edifying the new, of uniting our intelligences, our capacities, of being brave enough in seeing the ruins of an old order, of not merely imagining ourselves as grave diggers, but instead as those that in the midst of ruins are sowing, are planting seeds. Dare, despite difficulties, to endeavor, to build, and to do so in the spirit of Mario Benedetti's poem, in which he said, hay quienes se desmueren, hay quienes se desviven. Y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible, que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. But there are those who die, those who live in the endeavor, in the effort. And this way, between all of them, they achieve what was once thought to be impossible. That the entire world may know that the South also exists. And with you, together, we are determined to make it so, because we have collectively understood that the choice before us is either to come together and collectively forge the future that we want, or to allow ourselves to passively be forged by it. I think the choice is clear. Your presence, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, here today is answer enough, and it is for that I thank you.